Last episode we created our save and load panel, but it doesn't function yet. So let's make it work and complete our main menu today. To use this panel in the main menu as well as the novel scene, let's give it a custom save and load panel script. The purpose of this is to remove any scene dependencies for our load panel. Right now it works in our main menu, but we want to be sure that it works across all scenes. So our panel is going to have several buttons for loading files. The easiest way to keep track and organize all of our buttons is to create a class. This class should be serializable so we can edit it within the inspector. Also be sure to include the UI namespace since we'll be referencing UI classes like our button and raw image. Then populate the button class with the variables we'll want to control. I'm using a raw image to display the screenshot that will be taken when a file is saved. And I'm also going to have a text mesh pro object. So I'll need the tmpro namespace here. So this text will show the date and time the file was saved, along with any additional data if I choose to show anything. This way, along with the preview image, the player knows exactly what file they'll be loading. Additionally, I want the actual button component so we can control its interactability at any time. For instance, we don't want to load an empty file, so we would set an empty button to not interactable. Next, we want to define an array of buttons, so that way we can hold all data types for each button on our panel. We can proceed by removing start and update because this script won't use either of those. Next, we're going to have a function that we'll call whenever we want to load our files. We're going to have different pages, and each page will have a different set of files. We'll have like 1 through 6, then 6 through 12 maybe. So this will be represented by an integer. The integer will be the page, and all of the files will be for a directory. Now the directory is going to be from our file manager. We'll have the save path, and then we're going to have the save data where our files are located, the game files, which is the subdirectory, then the page, which is actually going to be a directory. So that page will be the directory holding each individual screenshot. Then we want to check and make sure that directory exists. If that directory does exist, then we want to iterate through each button in our array, or list up there. Actually, that is an array. And then we'll be checking if the file by that number exists. So for button 0, we should have a screenshot labeled 0, and if that exists, then that'll be populated into the button 0 picture field. We find that by having the directory, which ends off at the page and a backslant, and then just adding that incremental number in there to represent the screenshot. If it doesn't exist, then we just want to set that button to be non-interactable. If it does, then we want to make sure that it is interactable. Also, if it's not, then we'll want that preview display to be something that shows it's an empty file. So you can have some picture in your images folder, maybe empty game file. For this, I'm using resources.load and pulling it from the UI section. We'll be loading that as a texture 2D because that'll go nicely with our raw image. And we'll also want that date and time text to be set to something like empty game file or no game file. If it does exist, then we want to load the screenshot. And we already know what the screenshot file name is. It's what we were checking for up there. So we'll want to retrieve that through resources as a texture 2D object. And we'll actually change that instead of as texture 2D, just load it directly. you're a lot less prone to errors if you do it that way. Sometimes it works if the object is convertible, but if it's not, then you're better off using that immediate load there. Also, we'll want to make sure that that preview display becomes the preview image. Now, we don't have anything for our date and time yet, but we're just going to set something temporarily here. Now, if the directory doesn't exist, then we want to go through each button and make sure that everything is turned off. And let's go right back in here because I actually want to change the preview image name. I always do that. I always go back and change this stuff. Just to make it a little more, I guess, just to make it a little easier to read, we'll have our stuff saved in the format of the page and the screenshot number. So this will be located in save data and preview images. Just going to use the format structure here so that way I can insert all this without having to put in a bunch of plus marks. And we do that with squiggly brackets and indexes. So our page, dash, and then our screenshot number. We'll just have our comma, and then our parameters will automatically fill in those indexes. The first, of course, will be the page as a string, and then the second one will be I, but we have to remember the index is going to be one higher than we need. So subtract that by 1, convert it to a string, and that'll all format into our file name there. So that's where the preview images will be saved, in our preview images folder. So back in our novel controller, so then we'll have this information, these from line 118 to 120. All of this is what's going to help us actually save the preview images so we can load them again. So we have our screenshot directory, which is in the preview images folder. Then we'll try to make sure that directory exists by using try create directory. Then we'll get the path formatted as the directory and the active file name. And then we use screencapture.capture screenshot with that path to save the file that we're going to use. And we want to make sure that that path ends with whatever the file extension you're going to be using, JPEG, PNG. I'm just going to use PNG here, so that way we're actually saving it in an image format. So this will give us our preview image. At the time we save it, it's going to trigger this code, and it's going to take a snapshot of whatever's on the screen. Now for the date and time, we'll just use the system date and time there. So back in our game file, we need to actually put an area in here to save it. So the string modification data, we'll have another string, and this will be the preview image path. Both of those will just be empty right off the bat, and we will populate them in here. So active game file dot modification data will equal the date and time. So that's going to save the time that this file was saved into the actual file itself. We'll also have the texture 2D preview image, because we're going to want to save that here. So preview image path equals resources.load texture and the file that we just saved. So here we are in the editor. Go ahead and cancel that out. Let's just check here in save data. We have our file, which is auto1. Auto1 is what's going to be loaded. There's the game file. And our encrypted data, of course. Can't really read anything in there. But that is where, you see, we're actually loading an autosave. And in save data, our preview images, once we actually save it, here's the PNG. Open that up, and there's the picture. Works pretty good. Let's go ahead and back out of that. Now we need to make sure that that image will actually load once we go to open our save panel. So that should fill in one of these squares here. Whatever I use to save it, that's what should have the preview image and the date and time. So we have our load game bar, and we just have click load scene from our main menu script. Let's go in there real quick to see what that does. It's actually been a while since I've been in here. I don't think we have anything. So public and save panel. Let's make sure that we actually add the panel that's in the scene. Since we have this as an actual script, we can have instances in our main menu and in our novel controller. Not novel controller, but the novel scene. So here we are, click load game. So once we click that, it's going to open up the game panel, and we're going to want to save or load all of the data, the preview images, for each file in the currently loaded page. Now this page should be an integer, so that way we can just keep track of it whenever we change it with the buttons in the game load panel. So we'll have our save load panel dot, and then load the files onto screen, which is what we just created earlier, and our page will be the cached integer up there, the current save load page. So that'll load everything up, just following our game save panel up here, which checks for the directory, then checks for all the files, and everything that is in there. That should work. Alright, so right now we have no buttons, and I have 6 on screen, so I'm adding 6 brand new buttons. And for each one, I just want to make sure that I have the actual button itself, the raw image, which is going to display the preview image or the screenshot, and then the text that'll show the date and time that this file was saved. So I'll just be doing that for each one of these here. And there we go, they're all done. So we have all of our pictures. Now these little buttons up here, they should actually change what page we're loading. So we have 1, 2, 3 through 7, and those should be used with the load game panel. And one of the functions which should set the actual currently loaded page. So main menu events, actually game save panel, then load files onto the screen, and we'll use that same function, only changing the page here. So let's go ahead and save that scene. And back in our novel controller, we have the screenshot path. That's where the file name is saved. Let's just get rid of that for a second. Paste that up here, so that way it is out of our check. Change this directory to the screenshot path. Make sure we have PNG in there. Otherwise, it's probably not going to find the file that we want. Alright, so we're up now. New game. Just get something up here. Alright, so saved game file. We just saved it, and that should have taken a screenshot. So let's go into our assets, into save data, and there we see auto and autosave, which is our current file we're working on. Autosave is the name, there's all the data. And let's go find that screenshot. So that would be in resources. And save data, preview images, auto. and autosave. Alright, there's the picture. That's good. Notice how it was in the directory of auto and the actual file. So that works, but it's not loading our autosave, and that's because it's an autosave. It's not one of our main pages. So we need, in order to save it to one of our pages, we need to make those buttons interactable and have their own command. Now this command will be a void, and it'll be a click on save slot. Since these are save slots, and we'll just have our file number. Actually, we can use the button because we can just reference what button it is. You could use an integer and just either way it'll work. So the button B is null right now. Then for each button in our array, we want to find the one that has this particular button. So if the button is that button, then we will assign our active all caps button, which has all the information, to the one we just found. Now we want to do something with it. Once we click on it, when we're in one of those scenes, like when we're reading the novel, we open it up and we click on the button, we need to actually choose whether or not we're going to save or load from it, because we have both of those choices. From the main menu, we'll also have the delete choice, but that's something else entirely. So we'll have a different task up here. We have save to slot or load from slot. Like I said, we can also delete the file. We'll worry more about that later. Now this task is going to change for each button that we click. We're going to have this as a little cached variable up here, and just the default as load from slot, and we'll be manipulating that as we select different buttons from the menu. So when we click on the save slot, we'll have three different things to do. We can either save, load, or delete. Now, I have these as tasks right now. We are going to change that in a little bit. Just bear with me, because this just gives us an idea of what we're going to be doing. And we'll have the logic for each of these, but we are going to make separate commands in just a little bit. But for right now, we have our switch, and whatever the task is, right now it's just set for load. It's set for load as default, but if it were anything else, we just have our cases here. We have our load from slot, save to slot, and delete slot. Okay, so depending on whatever it might be, we'll have different logic here. So if we are loading from the slot, we have in our start new game in the main menu, we can just copy all that real quick and paste that in here. So we have our selective game file, which is auto-autosave at the moment. So we need to load the data from the file that is associated with the button that we clicked. So we'll get our game file using the file manager. Since it's an encrypted file, we'll load encrypted JSON. That data is going to be a game file. Now our file path. What is our file path? We can go back up in our novel controller into the load game file function, and we have, where is it? Our file path right here. The file manager save path. Copy that whole line, and let's go ahead and paste it up here. So our file path is the save path, save data game files, and then the active game file name, but that doesn't exist here. So the active game file name is actually something else. We have our let's go ahead and turn that from an array into a list of buttons. I always wind up doing that. I like lists better. They're much easier to work with. There are advantages to using arrays, but I normally just use lists. That's me. So in our main menu, we have a current save and load page. That page is, let's paste in here. So we're actually changing that. That shouldn't be associated with the main menu. That should be associated with the game save panel. So return, once we get the current save and load page, so return from the save panel. We need to make sure that's public in order for us to retrieve it. And since it's public, but I don't want to see it, we'll hide it in the inspector. So the save and load panel dot the current load page. So we'll return that just like that. So we can access that from the main menu, from the game save panel. Now, where we had length, since we changed this from an array to a list, we need to make sure that where we have buttons.length, it is now buttons.count. It's a difference between the list and the array. Okay, back to our slot task. So we should insert the current save and load page to string within that field. So that gets us our page, but now we need the file name. And the file name should be the buttons, and we have the index. The index of that button is always going to be the name of the file. So there's our file path, and now we can load that file path into the game file format. Alright, and our encryption keys. In order to decode this file, we need to decrypt it using the encryption keys that are right now saved in, I believe it's our file manager. Yeah, actually it's in our Novel controller. So we want to find that. That was somewhere down here, right under the temporary note here. So I'm going to go ahead and take that line and cut it out of the Novel controller. And we're going to reference it because I'm just moving it. I'm going to move the same keys. That way there's anything that I've already saved isn't going to be corrupted. So I'll just return file manager.keys, which doesn't exist yet. Let's go into file manager and then add public static followed by our byte array keys. And that's going to be, we'll paste that in there so that way we're using the same values. And there we go. Go ahead and give this a label. So these keys are used to decrypt the files, something just to let me know what this is about. Just as a good practice, just make comments. That way when you go back to your code, you always know what everything does. It's a really good practice. So we load that file and we decrypt it with the keys saved in the file manager. Alright, now, selected game file. This needs to be updated. So all of that is going to occur when we load from the game file. Now there is one thing here. Let me just say, what I normally do is before I make a video, I normally go through and do everything the first time, so that way I know exactly what I'm doing before I do it. I did not do that this time, so I was not quite as prepared. Let's change that to a string. We're not assigning to the main menu instance right now, so let's just string selected game file. Then let's duplicate this down for our save to slot. Now we go ahead and paste that in there, and inside of our game file, let's go ahead and make a static game file and label it as active file. So by having a static game file here, what we're doing is when we call active file from the game file class, we'll be instantly retrieving the game file that is currently loaded. And that'll be pretty convenient, as you'll see later on. So right off the bat, let's just go ahead and make that a new game file. To make things even more convenient for us, inside of our novel controller, where we have our active game file as null, let's instead retrieve that from the game file class itself. So using the get function, we'll say return gamefile.activeFile. And set will be gamefile.activeFile equals value, where we pass in the value as a game file. And let's move those selected game file and file path outside of the load slot and just right above it all so we can use it for each individual case. Inside save to slot, we'll have novelcontroller.instance.saveGameFile. Now in our save to slot, what we have is when we actually save a file, the active game file name is what's used to save the file. We get our file path, and inside of the game files directory is that active file name field. We want to manipulate that for the button that we click. So we want to make sure that this field is public and referenceable outside of that class. Just make sure we hide it in the inspector if we don't want to see it. And from here, we want to change that to novelcontroller.instance.activeGameFileName, and we will set that equal to the selected game file, that string that we made above, which is why we took it out of the load scope and outside so we can reference it with each case in here. Now, if the novel controller's instance is not in the scene, if there's nothing there, then we just want to return because there's nothing to save. In main menu events, which are events that are called from different objects on the scene, we have this close panel function, which is different depending on the name of the object that it's called on. We have our save and load panel, or a main menu, and when we close a panel, since this thing is being saved and used throughout the main menu and the novel scene, it's not going to have a different name. It's going to have the same name. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. And just make sure that when we close the panel, that we just set the game object to false. We don't care what the name is. We're just setting it to false. And now in our scene, our load game panel, that disables, and it'll no longer be showing. What we want to do is, in order to use this throughout the scenes, just to make it easier on ourselves, let's go into our assets and make a folder called prefabs, and we're just going to save our current load game panel inside of there. So as we make a change, it'll update through each scene. Making prefabs, go inside of there for more organization. I'm making another folder, UI, and inside of that is my load game panel. I realize we are all over the place today. I will include the project link in the description for anyone who wants to download it, along with the source code. So there's our prefab, our save and load game panel. Let's go ahead and load the novel scene, and on our canvas, let's add the save and load game panel. There we are. We have this in our foreground layer. Let's open that up. Actually, close that out. Okay, so the save and load game panel is going to be above the foreground. Since it's lower, it'll be rendered above, and that's what we want. We want that to show above anything. Back in the novel controller, we want to make sure that we have a reference to that panel, so that way we can actually save things and call it to open up when we press different keys. So we'll have our save and load panel there, which means when we have start, we just want to make sure that this thing is inactive. So save load panel .gameObject.set active false. We don't want it to be visible. And if I'm not mistaken, there is an update. Yes, there is. So we want to add some cases here to open it up. So if we have input, get key down, and we'll just say keycode.mouse1. So if we press the right mouse button, then we want to say save and load panel.gameObject.setActive true. We want to make sure that it's visible. Then save and load panel.getComponent animator set trigger activate, so that way it'll fade in. In our game save panel, let's have a button here for selected button. Whatever we click, we want to cache it. We'll also hide that in the inspector as well. So when we click on a save slot, we go through that whole process of finding whatever button it is, and we'll go ahead and cache that value into the selected button field we just made up top. So whenever we click on a button, we're going to save it, we're going to know what it is, and we can reference it again when we need it. Index of B, make sure that's still right. And selected button, because we changed that actually. Alright, so here we are. Then we have our back key here. We want to make some new buttons here. These will be where we actually decide whether we load, save, or delete. So open it up and change the text inside. So when we click one of those file buttons, it's going to cache it, and that will then open up the load, save, and delete buttons. Once we click one of those, we'll reference our cached button, and we'll decide what to do with it, to either load, save, or delete it. So we have our button references for each of those. And let's come down here. We have, in our click save slot, here's what I was talking about earlier, where we're going to make all of these into different functions. So a public void load from selected slot. After we've selected something and we click the load button, this is going to execute to load that file. Now file path is not in that function, so let's go ahead and take those and paste them in there, and we're good. Selected game file, since we're going to be using that throughout each one, we can also make that cached as well as the file path. So selected file path, and then just get rid of that there. So now we cache all that data in here, and we can reference it for each of our little functions below. Just make sure we change the name of that there, because I changed it up top. Selected file path. And now, get rid of that empty space, change file path to selected file path, and the data that we accessed above can be used in the below functions. Okay, so that is loading. Now after we have this information selected, We want to just make sure that the file actually exists, and then that will determine whether we enable the load, save, and delete buttons or not. Alright, so we have if the file exists and if it does not. So we have our buttons that we described up above, the load, save, and delete. We're just going to reference those here and change the interactability depending on if the file exists or not. Load button.interactable equals true. Delete button interactable equals true. And we have our save button, but maybe there's a case where you want to define if you will allow each of these functions from different scenes. As such, the main menu and the novel scene may have different permissions from the main menu. You may never want to save a file, so we would always have that as disallowed. So we can just make 3 different booleans up top. Allow saving from this screen. If that's false, then you will never be able to save as long as you're on this screen. But once you go to a different scene, then maybe you would. So the bool for each of these, just set default as true. We can change those from the inspector before we export. And in the place of true, we'll just set those variables. So load button interactable equals allow loading from this screen. Delete interactable is allow delete from this screen. And save, allow saving from this screen. That'll allow us to have further control over these options depending on what scene we're in. Just copy and paste all those in the else field. But this time, we want to make sure that we can never load and we can always delete. Save button interactable will still remain as allow saving from this screen. Alright, I believe that is it for there. Actually, make sure we have the selected button .date and time text, because if the file doesn't exist, then we want to make sure that we pop a little error. Say, file not found. And for even more emphasis, maybe we can say you make use of those rich text tags, say color equals red. So that way it really stands out. Okay, and that looks about right there. When we load from the selected slot, that looks good. So now we can go to the next one, which is save to selected slot. And again, with all this stuff cached, it makes it easier to just move from one function to the next. So we want to save the open game file, which is of course our active game file, but all we're worried about is the slot here. So if novel controller's instance is not equal to null, then we want to make sure that we use the save game file function from the novel controller. Let's move on to public void delete slot. And for right now, we're just going to have a little print message here. Not going to worry about deleting anything just yet. Alright, so back in the editor, let's actually make these functions and use them. So we'll select our buttons here, change them to non-interactable to start off with, then select load, go down to the events here, drag in the load panel, go down there, and then load from selected slot. Do the same thing with save, drag that in there, and choose save to selected slot, then delete, and delete slot. So each of those, once they become active, will trigger one of those functions. We could actually go ahead and give that a shot. Let's check out this image here. Yeah, okay, so these buttons have nothing assigned to them yet. Let's not forget to do that. Go ahead and select all the buttons, including that one, drag in the panel, game save panel, then that is click on save panel, click on save slot, and then for each one, just drag itself into that variable field. Alright, when we load the selected slot, we can say GameObject.setActive false. So we'll deactivate the panel. Back in Update, you see where we have, if we press mouse 1, then the load panel is going to become active. Well, it should only happen if it's not active. So if the save and load panel is active in the hierarchy, then we need to disable it. But if it's not, then we need to enable it, as we were doing earlier. So let's cut that and activate it. And then just deactivate, because that'll trigger an event at the end of it. And that'll close it out automatically. So back in Save panel, just want to make sure that we have everything we need here. Alright, so the current save and load page should become equal to the page that we're loading. Just like that. Alright, now drag that prefab back onto the other one, just to make sure everything updates nice, and let's not forget to add these load, save, and delete buttons to our save panel script. Otherwise we will get a null reference error. Those are never fun. And back, well, we have nothing for back right now. So we'll need to make a function for that. Back should actually close out the save and load panel. Right now, let's just go ahead and try it out, see everything we've got so far. So we're in the novel scene, and we right click, open it up. See, we have our different buttons here. And we right click again, closes it out, opens back up. That portion seems to be working just fine. Once we click on the file, then those buttons become active. We can save, and you can see the message down there. We saved the file successfully. Save on one again, and we saved that file. So let's check this out. When we save to the selected slot, we just want to make sure that we update a few values. One of which we will go into the novel controller, the instance, and the active game file name. We want to make sure we change that, and that is actually going to be the selected game file. So we'll just be updating that immediately once we save a file from a button. Also, there was that back button on the menu we were looking at earlier. Let's go ahead and make something called close panel. And inside we'll just say if the game object is currently active, then we'll go ahead and set it to inactive using that animation. So we do get component animation set trigger and then deactivate. So once we hit that back button, that's going to close out as if we just hit the right mouse button. Just another small little thing, but every little bit adds up to make a better visual novel. Let's update that prefab one more time. Go ahead and start the engine now. Now, right click, press the back button, and it closes out. Just like that. Very good. Alright, saving that file. See the message saved the file with 782 bytes. Nothing's updated. You see that? We got nothing updated at all. Let's exit out of there real quick. And in our novel controller, we have get key down. We need to update after we click on a button, or after we save anything too. Once we actually activate this panel, we need to make sure that we re-update all of the items within the page that's selected. We'll do that using the save and load panel .load files onto screen, and the save and load panel's current page. Now that's changed anytime we click one of those buttons. There's also a thing where if we save a file right now, it's going to save the menu in it. So we'll see all those buttons and everything, and that's because it's active at the time of the image being saved. When we come into the game save panel, then we should actually have a delay between when the panel is deactivated and when the screenshot is actually taken. So a screenshot is made right at this point, and before then, right here, we want to disable the panel. The game object set active false. So we're hiding the panel before we save, before we take that screenshot. And then after, game object.set active true. So we re-enable it after the screenshot is taken. Disable screenshot, re-enable. And unfortunately, I think I did something backwards here. Yeah, so if the file exists, then we want to make sure interactable is true. If it doesn't, then we should make sure that it's false. And here, button interactable is allow. Right here, that's what I did backwards. Just remove that not, so that way if it does exist, everything is interactable, following the rules that we set above with those allow booleans. And for organization, we can just make each page a directory by making that tac a backslash. You don't have to, but I'm going to. I like to keep things much more organized. Then that looks fine there. Okay, let's go ahead and say public canvas group, because we want to control the alpha of that panel. So that way, instead of actually disabling the object, which would prevent a save, we want to just change the alpha, and change the alpha of every object attached to that group. So instead of disabling, we say alpha equals 0, essentially accomplishing the same thing. And then to re-enable it in the scene, canvas group alpha equals 1. Told you guys I was kind of all over the place today, but we're getting there. Alright, so this right now already has a canvas group. We just need to make sure that we add that into this variable here. Because as you remember, that canvas group alpha is what's changed during animations. Now let's open it up, and we can see everything's selectable again. Click on that. Now for those two files, something is already saved. You remember that. So as I click them, they don't change. But the other ones have that no file found error. We come into game files, into the 1 directory, and we have 1 and 3, which are these files right here. So something's saved there, but the screenshot is not being updated, and neither is the text. Where we have this load panel, and we load all the files from that page onto the screen. As we click the right mouse button, there's that one. And there is that image. That one has the menu visible in it, you can see. But that picture is showing, and the no data yet is unfortunately still there. I need to go ahead and change that. Now I can't click load once I select an empty file. You see it's disabled. Once I click one of those that has something saved to it, we have the option to load. And that's exactly what it does. It was pure white, and that's not good. But if we go back into the game and click it, then there it is. So why is that? Why is it white, but once we exit the application and come back in, it suddenly is able to load the picture? That's because once we actually exit and come back in, the image is then detected by the Unity editor. Once it's saved at runtime, it actually doesn't detect it yet. So we want to make sure that we load the picture as a texture immediately when we save it. And also that date and time text, that was already saved into the game file when we did our game file save earlier. So we can change that as well. So game file equals file manager dot load encrypted JSON game file, and we will follow the expected file with the file manager's encryption keys. And we're going to be loading that file here and just retrieving the data from it, that date and time text. So file.modification date, which is what it was. So that'll set that text. We'll actually be able to see some progress there. And here we are back in the game save panel. Last time I'm going to do this, let's do game object set active false, because as I think about it, I don't want to mess with those animator values. So set active true. Now what we want to do is we want to get that animator component, and once we reactivate it, because after it's deactivated, we want to make sure that it's instantly visible again. We don't want it to fade in. We want it to be instantly visible. So we'll set a trigger called instant visible. Hasn't been created yet, so let's go ahead and go into the Unity editor, to our panel, inside of the animator, and just add a new trigger and call it instant visible. And we'll go from any state, make transition to the active, and make sure that the settings, the transition time is immediate. Simple as that. And that should be set for the condition of instant visible. So let's go ahead and launch it. We press the right mouse button. Let's go ahead and save. We saved there. Load back up. You can still see that panel is still visible. So clearly, by setting deactivated, taking the screenshot and reactivating, it's not quick enough. There's not enough time in between because everything's executed so close together. It's all in the same frame. So that tells me that what we need to do instead is use a coroutine. Use a coroutine and wait a specific amount of time after deactivating. So what we'll do is we'll come down here and make an IEnumerator called saving file, and we're just going to take from here down. We'll say coroutine saving file equals null, so that way we can deactivate it if we're trying to do it. So if the novel controller instance is not null and saving file is null, then we'll set saving file to equal a new start of that coroutine, and inside we'll paste the information and make sure that we yield right after we set it to false. Yield until the end of the frame, at which point we will take our screenshot, yield for one more frame, and then enable. That gives us a sandwich zone for taking that application screenshot. So with that happening, we should have no menu inside of our screenshot. Then we'll say saving file equals null, just so that way we're not stuck with only being able to save once. In there and check it out. Number 6, the file that we saved, the menu is no longer visible. We just have a clean shot of everything that was behind it. And now we load for the second time and everything's there again. We can load the 6th file, takes us there. So date and time text. Let's just change that a little bit so we have our page and then maybe a new line and then our modification data. So we'll have the number of our file and then the data that belongs to it. Go ahead and start a new game. So now we're actually in the auto file. Let's come in here to where we load the game file. We have our encrypted game files here. So if encrypt game file, so we have the choice of one or the other. We do all that. We save the JSON. Now if the file does exist, then let's come right here and paste all that in there. If it doesn't exist, we create it. If it does, if the file doesn't exist, then we're going to say active game file equals new game file. There will be absolutely no data inside of it. It's just going to be a completely new game file. So let's open save data here real quick. Open it up, game files, then auto. Let's go ahead and delete that. So there's nothing in there. There should be no auto files there. Start new save. We have our preview images. Go ahead and delete the auto images as well. It's that white image. Now, in order to get that picture, we'll have to set it after we save the file. So selected game file, date, time, text, we set it immediately so that way that updates. We don't have that no file found error message, and we can come into the save right here where we take the screenshot. Instead of just using the screenshot.capture screenshot, we want to use that texture 2D field here. The preview image path, or preview image, because it's not really a path anymore, it's just the image itself. And we'll be saving that inside of the game file, and what we can do is we can use that immediately after the file is saved and set that as the preview image. So we won't be getting that white image anymore. Instead, we'll be getting what we just saved. So we do that by saying game file active image, preview image equals screenshot capture. And then byte texture data, we'll convert that into the byte array, and we'll say FileManager.save composing bytes. So we'll take all of those bytes and save them to a PNG file, which will manually create the image. But we'll be retrieving the texture right there as well. So we'll be retrieving the texture, which we can use immediately, and set it into the game file, and we'll also be saving it. That's a workaround there, just so we don't wind up with those white boxes every time we save something. Now, screenshot path is file manager save path, save data game files, active game file name, PNG. And the screenshot directory. Yeah. So we don't really need that. We just need the path. The path has the directory. And the PNG is in the path, so we're good there. Now when we click on the save slot, back in our game, save panel, looking up here, our texture 2D preview image equals resources.load, texture 2D right there. So we load that texture, and then in the game save panel, where we set the interactable, we have the byte array of the preview image data. So we'll load the composing bytes of that PNG, and then we'll get the image from it. And then file preview image, we set that as the preview image, and then set the texture to what we just retrieved. So we're taking the bytes of the file that we saved, converting it to a texture, So at this point, we have our main menu and our save and load panel working correctly. That was quite a bit. But one thing should be noted, that we should only be able to save if the input screen or the choice menu are not active. We don't want to open that up and be able to save during the middle of a choice or anything. Because that'll take additional coding. If you wanted to do that, you'd have to load the choices, you'd have to save the choices, the inputs, all of that. It's much easier if we just keep our saving outside of those two functions. So that's it for the main menu, and that is it for saving and loading. Our next focus is just going to be on exporting the game. We'll be focusing on that, and also how to delete files from the save panel in case you want to make room. So we're about to close this series off. Appreciate everyone being here. Sorry this one was so all over the place. It was a little weird. I'm not gonna lie, it was a little weird, but but there we are. Like I said, the file is going to be in the description. We'll have the whole project and the source code as well, so you can download that, compare it to yours, or even add your own information to it, so that way you can just take that engine and expand on it, make it your own. That's really what this whole thing is about, just learning how to perform all these exercises, how to make your own engine. So it doesn't matter if you download mine or do anything, it's still yours. You could still make those changes and still make your story from it. And everything you add onto it to make it your own unique thing, all the better. So I'll see you in the next part where we conclude this off.